This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
He said, "You know what this is?" I said, "Yeah, it's a razor blade." He said, "I got you at my mercy, don't you?"
And here, they were guards and I was a convict. And that's the way it was. You knew where you were.
He says, "I wish you would just learn to behave like ladies."
And he said, "If you draw any blood, I'll kill every man in there." So the man dropped the knife and turned to the other men that were with him that he had set loose out of the various cells and said, "Well, he means it. He'll kill us if we don't give up." So they gave up.
You do your own number, you do your own time. If you hear something, you keep it within yourself. If you see something, you're blind to it. I don't care if it's a killing, whatever. You just don't see it.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Behind Gray Walls, a podcast about the men and women that serve behind the walls of the old Idaho State Penitentiary. My name is Anthony, and I'm joined in the studio here with Skye.
Hello.
And today we've got some pretty good stories for you. Mine is a little graphic. It's a little violent, so listener discretion, that of course is always advised, but particularly for my section.
Well, and I'll bring us up with a little less gruesome. We're going to talk about Prohibition Violator. So it's a crime that is no longer a problem anymore. I mean, they're different adjacent problems, but I'll kind of come in and hopefully make it less like, ugh.
Good.
We'll see.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, this is like the
that.
Josie and the Sam Stevens. My story isn't quite as fun as Sam Stevens, but I found out some really cool stuff. I'm very excited about it. So I'll let you start.
Just before the podcast, Skye was like, "Let me just double check one thing," and just freaked out. So I'm super excited to hear what it is.
Yeah. Well, and I ended up writing her entire biography like crazy wrong. So I was very excited to find out how completely wrong I was the first time. But it's because I didn't have access to Ancestry when I first wrote it.
Right,
So she has a ton of stuff on Ancestry. I'm very excited. Let's start.
Okay, so my inmate today is Charles Cleveland Sandusky, number 2626. My sources, of course, is Inmate File, the Idaho Daily Statesman, Library of Congress, Chronicling America, Ancestry, including like the World War I draft card, which always is helpful, the Colorado State Archives, and the Union's Pacific website, up.com. That'll become clear very shortly. So I actually came across Charles Sandusky in a similar way to William H. Thomas, who, as previously I mentioned, he carved, I suspect, carved his initials into the side of two house. So last summer, some fourth grade students came through, and they always have the best questions about the most random things. And
they always notice stuff that you're like, I literally have never seen that before. It's,
oh my gosh.
It's really interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. So this little kid raises his hand. Excuse me, what does May 1921 CCS mean? And this is in the cement in front of the territorial prison. And so I was like, moving on. I don't know. I really don't know. So, of course, I wrote that down. I went back to my office, and just like William H. Thomas, WHT, I just started going through the prison index, which we have available on our website, so you can check that out. So I started in S's and just went through every name last name that started with an S, and came across an inmate named Charles C. Sandusky and went, oh my gosh, I think I have some pretty good evidence that kind of proves at a reasonable rate that it was him that wrote this down, and we'll get to that.
And this is what Anthony does best, by the way. Like, he will take the smallest little thing and he will just get the entire story. It's really impressive. It's really cool what Anthony can do.
I love it. Oh my gosh. I love it. It's my favorite. Researching is my favorite thing to do.
It's super fun. Yeah. And it's only history nerds like us who get it, because everyone else is like, that sounds like the most boring thing in the world.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah. This part is also I've learned to really like. So, like telling people all of this. So, Charles is born in St. Joseph, Missouri, and also known as St. Joe, on December 5th, 1884. And St. Joseph is the northwest. It's up in northwest Missouri. It's about 30 miles north of Kansas City, Missouri. And during the westward expansion, those heading down the Oregon Trail would purchase supplies. They would stop in St. Joe and basically stock up on their supplies before they headed west. It's also the birthplace of the Pony Express, the service that delivered mail and newspaper via horseback between California and Missouri before the invention of the transcontinental telegraph in 1861. It's also where famous outlaw Jesse James, his gang was involved, and that's where he was shot and killed. Wow. And actually, so that was 1882, 2 years before Charles is born. Okay. And Jesse James was he was in his living room and kind of cleaning up a picture, and a member of his gang actually pulled a revolver out and shot him in the back.
Dang.
Yeah. And, Marshall Mathers, also known as
Eminem.
Yeah.
Eminem.
Was born in St. Joseph, Missouri as well. So another
there you go.
connection.
I didn't know that.
So many
I always assumed he was
there.
from Michigan.
Detroit?
Doesn't he talk about
Detroit
I think
a
lot
he
in
grew
his
up
songs?
there. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Also unrelated, but if we're going to bring up singers, Cher has a song sort of about Jesse James, but...
Wow.
I actually had a conversation about this yesterday. I don't remember who with. Oh, it was with Matt and Charlie. And I was like, that's not, like, they were singing of something about him getting shot in the living room, actually. And I was like, that's not what her song is about. But
just so everyone knows, Skye...
How are you going to say this?
Has a tattoo of Cher on her arm. She is, a little bit of a fan.
Listen, I have liked Cher for 15 years of my life. I have every album. I'm collecting all of her old albums on vinyl. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
It's
great. Yeah.
You'll hear, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm really into old movies. I'm very into Cher. These things will be brought up constantly throughout the podcast, I'm sure. Anyway, we are off track. Jesse James from St. Joe, Missouri. Killed
2 years before Charles is born.
Joseph.
Yes. So Charles, born December 1884. His parents were pioneers that came to northern Missouri in the 1840s, just before the Great Migration. The Oregon Trail was like at its
They're not
early
LDS,
peak
are they?
in 1843.
Not LDS pioneers.
No,
Okay.
I don't believe so. Yeah, and his parents, they were George Lucas Sandusky and Margaret Maggie Belcher Sandusky, and so his original name is actually Sodowsky, Sadowski, kind of.
Okay, so it's like a Polish.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
But it seems like his siblings, Charles, and his siblings changed their spelling to Sandusky.
Okay.
So Charles had 3 siblings. He had an older sister named Daisy and 2 younger brothers named George, who he lists on his intake as his closest living relative, and Floyd, and who he would later name a child of his after. And they are listed as living in St. Joseph, Missouri in 1900, and Charles lists his occupation then. He's about 15, 16 years old as a delivery man. And it's around 1900, 1901, at the age of about 16, 17, that he says he leaves his home. Mm-hmm. So between 1900 and 1910, Charles meets and marries Poet Ann Harris, so Poet Sandusky. And Poet was born in Bolivar, Missouri.
Sorry, her name is Poet.
Her name is Poet.
Okay,
it's the coolest.
It's such a Puritan style name,
Mm-hmm.
like how they always used to do like humility and chastity and all those virtue names.
Harmony
Poet.
and,
Okay, I like it. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, me
Okay,
too.
sorry.
So she's born. It's in central Missouri, north of Springfield, and in total, Charles and Poet would have 5 children together. Their first were actually a set of twin boys named Floyd and Lloyd in December of 1906.
Why do people do that?
They have these 2 in St. Joseph, Missouri. Then they had Bernice in November of 1909, and Raymond in 1915, and Norma in 1917. I believe that the family moved to Colorado sometime in 1909, where Bernice would, I believe, be born.
Okay.
And I only say this because Charles is incarcerated for the first time in the Colorado State Penitentiary in August 1909. And he is charged with robbery. And he's sentenced to 15 years at the penitentiary. And he's given the number 7536. I dug and dug and dug and dug. I could not come across what he robbed, what the crime was.
Right.
Unfortunately, there's a Sandusky, Ohio. So every search on Library of Congress went directly to that. Yeah. So I don't know if his name was misspelled in the newspaper. I tried several different spellings. Anyway, Colorado State Archives have this fantastic overview of the history of the prison of Colorado. So I thought maybe instead of talking about his crime in Colorado, I'll talk about that. This volunteer at the Colorado State Archives, this is a shout out to him. His name was Gerald E. Sherrard, who created this really cool, comprehensive history of the prison. And Colorado State Penitentiary is such a similar history, early development to Idaho's. It was established by their territorial legislator in 1868, just like ours, and Cannon City. And one cell house was constructed and completed in 1871, just a few months after our territorial cell house was completed. Yeah. And it was the space that they chose was chosen because of stone that was quarried to construct.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I was just like blown away by all the similarities here. Their first cell house only had 42 cells, just like ours. Their first prisoners arrived in January of 1871, just about a year before ours did. And Colorado, of course, became a state in 1876, so 14 years before Idaho does. Right. So the prison actually developed much more rapidly than ours did. By 1904, they had 4 cell houses that could hold 544 men and a separate cell house for women.
Was it inside the walls? Okay.
Yeah. And like Idaho, Colorado prisoners were sentenced to hard labor and expected to work. They had jobs in carpentry, blacksmithing, shoe cobbling, tailoring, quarrying, just like Idaho. And interestingly, during the time that Charles was there, between 1909 and February 1912, the warden at that time, his name was Thomas J. Tynan, created this really cool program where any inmate that was willing to work was given the opportunity to work at road camps outside the prison walls, and they were completely unguarded.
Wow.
Yeah. And they were blasting rocks through the Rocky Mountains and creating these amazing roads through there. Tynan reported that instead of sending broken, revengeful men back into the world, in no wise reformed, but simply trained to greater cunning, there are being restored mended men eager and willing to be made as such use as society will permit. By removing the continual threat of arms, by eliminating oppression and brutalities, by establishing a system of graded rewards for cheerfulness and industry, the penitentiary has given a wholesome, helpful atmosphere. So it was this really progressive concept, and there were I think it was a fraction of 1% of the men that went out there that escaped. And so
that's interesting.
Yeah, this is a really cool system. And Idaho actually did a really similar thing around this time as well.
Did it work as well?
It did actually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating. I mean, but it does kind of, I think often when I think of prison, I kind of think of the whole do your own number, do your own time. But really what I mean by that is also there's respect given. If there's respect given to these inmates, then they'll give respect back.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is it's like a respectful system where it's we're understanding that you're people, and you did this thing and you have to work to make up, to help pay back what you did.
Right.
But you are people, you are capable, you're adults, and you're capable of I don't want to say taking care of yourself, but you can self-govern, and so we trust you, and that trust then is going to reciprocate. And so that's really interesting.
Yeah. It was such a concept that I think with our prison population, I don't know if it would work, if it would translate today in a similar way. I mean, we have work release programs which are great, and that's a great way to re-socialize and just before you enter the society again, like 97% of convicts do.
But I do think the nature of I don't want to say convicts, because I don't think the nature of people has necessarily changed, but I think because of the system, you think about the rate of recidivism and things like that, the prison life is just different now. And so I mean, I don't know, it's interesting to think about. I just don't think it would work. Unfortunately, I wish it would. Because again, I think humans are much more willing to do what is asked when they are shown that they are trusted. But I mean, that is so hard, because I think people have become a little bit more manipulative about getting out or saying what they need to say in order to get what they want. And it's obviously, I'm not saying that they didn't do that back then. We find plenty of instances of that, but I wish it would work. That would be really neat.
And and since all the roads have been created, we would have to create some sort of equivalent.
Yeah, and that would be hard.
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
You know, I mean, we have machines do everything these days.
Right, yeah,
so-
where this was literal hard labor, and you worked all day, and then you went back to your tent camp, and you were probably exhausted, and
Yeah.
there's no reason to escape because you're just like, well,
Well, and you're not sentenced to hard labor anymore. Like, can they legally actually make you? They can't legally make you necessarily work like that. You get paid because they have certain jobs. Like, I know that some companies use prisoners to make their clothes and things like that,
Yeah.
and they get paid for it. But they can't make them do hard labor anymore, can they?
I don't believe so. I think the closest thing would be like prison industries, but that is you apply for that sort of
Right.
position, and there's a wait list, and
Yeah.
it's a whole different thing. We should actually reach out to somebody in prison industries and kind of talk
should.
about that.
Yeah.
Future podcast episode. Okay, so in 1914. I don't know what happens between 1912 and 1914. If they stayed in Colorado, they went back to Missouri. But in 1914, they moved to Glens Ferry, Idaho. And Glens Ferry is a city. It's in like kind of south central Idaho. It's in Elmore County. It's adjacent to the Snake River. It has one of the most famous and treacherous river crossings of the Oregon Trail in this area that was called Three Island Crossing. And yeah, have you been there?
I haven't been there. I drive to Utah quite frequently, and so I
Yeah.
always see the signs for it. And to give you sort of an idea, Glens Ferry is really close to King's Cross, which is where Josie Kensler's story took place. So this is the same general area.
That's
A
great.
couple years apart, obviously, but
Yeah, so back in the 1843 to 1869, they used these three islands to cross the Oregon Trail, and basically, it was a super treacherous thing to do. There were a lot of deaths, and
well, the
basically
river was
late
super
summer,
deep.
Yeah,
and
if-
it's swift.
It's
the
very
Snake River's
swift. Yeah. So you imagine you're on horseback, you have wagons crossing this. I actually found this journal from the first man who crossed it, William T. Newby, back in 1842. And he said the river was low enough, and so they attempted to cross it. And basically, if you crossed it there, it shortened your route to Oregon. It wasn't as desertous like it would be if you traveled southern Idaho, all the way to Fort Boise, the old Fort Boise. So he says, first we drove over a part of the river 100 yards wide onto an island. Then over a northern branch 75 yards wide on a second island. Then we tied a string of wagons together by a chain in the ring of the lead cattle's yoke and made fast to the wagon of all horse and before and him led. It was hard to
that face you just
comprehend.
made was kind of hilarious.
We carried as many as 15 wagons at one time. The water was 10 inches up the wagon beds in the deepest places.
Oh my gosh.
10 inches up the wagon beds.
Yeah, so that's, I
Yeah.
mean, those things are almost underwater.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, there were so many fatalities. It was a gamble. Do we
Yeah,
cross
absolutely.
here, shorten this trip, make it an easy, leisurely thing, or do we take the long road 500 miles to this side of the old Fort Boise to cross near Parma,
Right.
to cross?
If
And-
you've ever played the Oregon Trail computer game, which by the way is available online, these are decisions you have to face all the
Yes.
time. I,
Yeah.
by the way, just on a side note, which this episode is full of, played that one time and made it like 5 months late, but no one died. I'm just saying it's possible.
I did.
You should play it. It's fun. Anyway,
I
again,
remember I had somebody die as we were leaving the main ground, and I was just like, I can't do this. This is too hard.
I was so concerned about these fake hypothetical people that they'd be like, your daughter got sick with dysentery, and I'd be like, we're camping for 3 months, but it's December, we're staying. No one died.
So good.
We just made it really late with very few supplies. Crossing rivers took a really long time.
Oh, I love that.
Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, yeah. So if you're interested in coming there, there's a great. It's now a state park, 3 Mile 3 Mile Island State Park, and it has this great interpretive center. And in the 80s, there were these reenactors who they tried it themselves, and they struggled. There was this great story of this pack mule who bucked off his rider and went back to the South Shore, and 15 of the riders of the 16 made it across, and then this mule just like on the other side. And then he actually didn't even use the islands. He found his own way across. So he just like
little
skated
pack
across.
mule. Pack mules do what they want.
Yeah, it's great. Finally, in 1869, this man named Gustavus Galen, Gus Galen, built a ferry to help travelers cross the river about a mile south of where the city now stands. And Gus, he was a freight hauler. He hauled huge wagons full of supplies between Oregon and Boise, and he realized in 1869 that there was a need for people to cross, and that all these deaths were happening, all these different things. So he's like, I'm going to build a boat. I'm going to build a ferry. And that was his gig. That's what he did. Yeah, so that's what the town is named after. In the 1880s, Glens Ferry becomes this important rail hub, and by 1888, the town is platted. And, of course, the original town, it burns down twice in the 1890s, so most of those original buildings were destroyed. But developed, because of the railway system, and with irrigation and lumber, it's kind of developed into an important little city. And it was basically filled up with Union Pacific employees and people who worked the fields because, they worked symbiotically together. Yeah, and they had this important roundhouse that was built in Glens Ferry, so it allowed trains to turn around and go backwards or stop and be serviced and taken care of. So Glens Ferry had a pretty interesting history. I found on that Union Pacific website this great story about this opera theater being constructed in 1914 in Glens Ferry, and vaudeville performers would stop in. They would take that Union Pacific, they'd stop in all these little western towns, they'd stop in Glens Ferry, and if a train was going through during their performance, the plays would stop. Everybody would stop. They would wait for the whistle to sound, and as soon as it would, everybody in the audience would stand up and start singing, "I've been working on the railroad."
Oh my God.
And then as soon as the train made it through the town, the play would start right back up where
Listen,
it stopped.
I just think that life in the early 20th century sounds like a scary time, but also sounds like such a fun time. Like everyone just sort of seems to be on the same page.
Right.
Like they know how to work really hard, but they also know how to play really hard. And that sounds so fun. Like,
yes.
Who would have ever thought that you needed to build an opera house of all things in Glens Ferry, which like it's just a little town that I've never even been to it. I just drive past it on my way to Utah. So that's so funny.
Yeah.
I love those kind of stories.
So just like the majority of the town, Charles is working in Glens Ferry as a switchman for the railroad.
Makes sense.
And that's a really dangerous job. I mean, you're working really close to trains and you're making sure the tracks are turned so they can move and everything. And so he leaves regularly, and he's, working at different rail yards and stuff. And so on August 9th, 1917, he returns home after about a month away, and he drinks and he's intoxicated, and he starts to brutally assault his wife. Ugh. And this attack, I mean, it's so bad. The screams get so loud that neighbors who said that they regularly heard them quarreling, they decided to call the police this time. No. And the police arrive, and she is just beaten up terribly. So about 7 o'clock, he's arrested and taken to the jail, the Glens Ferry jail. It's about 3 blocks from his house. And within 2 hours, he would escape.
How did he escape?
He sawed his way through the iron bars in his cell.
With what?
He had snuck in a saw. And
what?
Yes, a hacksaw. And so he escapes. He returns to his house and brutally stabs his wife a bunch of times.
But it wasn't even her fault.
Right.
It wasn't her.
Right. Ugh. So this is about 9:30 in the evening. So he escapes from the jail, stabs his wife with a pocket knife a bunch of times. A neighbor hears these brutal screams and runs over with a gun. And that's where he discovers Mrs. Sandusky, and he calls the police. They find out that Charles is missing, and they are on the lookout for him. Mrs. Sandusky is unconscious in the front yard with 22 stab wounds across the throat, breast, head, and arms. Neighbors.
He just did this because he was drunk and mad?
I believe so. Well, I think there's a history of brutality, so we'll get to that later in the story here. Yeah, this is not. She's also 7 months pregnant when this happens. With their last child together. Yeah.
Or is their fifth?
Their fifth.
Their
yeah.
fifth.
Yeah. So this is, she survives all of this. She gets beaten and stabbed 21 times, and she survives this whole thing.
Gosh.
Charles was seen running south to the outskirts of Glen Ferry towards the Snake River, and friends and neighbors testified, that they had seen them quarrel, they had seen all of this happen, but nobody thought it was necessary to intervene until that night. So this is a pretty big thing that they witnessed.
Sorry,
she wasn't
what year
expected,
is this?
So this is 1917.
Okay.
Yeah, so no one expected her to survive, but after several weeks in the hospital, she survives, and 2 months later, they have their last child. She gives birth to their last child. So a posse of men search for Sandusky, and they turn up nothing. They don't see him. He just disappears. And they thought that maybe he was hiding in the city or in the hills nearby. The sheriff sent out a description to officers all over the West and offered a $100 reward for his capture. And that's a lot of money for one of these guys. And the description reveals that he had been arrested in Douglas County, Colorado in 1909 for a robbery. He was sentenced there and served time there until 1912. So just a tiny bit more information than I could get from his intake.
Wait, did you just say he was sentenced there until 1912?
From 1909 to 1912.
In Colorado.
Yeah, he
okay,
spent
sorry.
2.5 years there. Yeah.
Sorry.
And so this is his description. Sandusky is a railroad switchman, age 35, height 5 feet 6 inches, weight 135 pounds, blue-gray eyes, sandy complexion, smooth shaven, may-raised mustache, which will be sandy, pit scar and center of forehead about the size of a dime, twitches mouth when talking, great tobacco chewer, is quarrelsome and boasts of his fighting ability. He has served time in Colorado State Prison and been in jails all over the country. There's a whole manhunt out for him, and the sheriff believes that he had thrown himself into the Snake River and drowned. I mean, it's a rapid river. Over the next few weeks, over 1,000 letters and cards arrive in the sheriff's office from as far as Detroit, Michigan, from people who claim that they saw Charles. After a grueling 6 months of searching, Charles was finally captured in El Paso, Texas, under the alias Floyd T. Lynn. Detectives were tipped off from a telegraph from Tucson, Arizona, stating that Sandusky was in their city. They captured him in front of the El Paso post office, and an Idaho sheriff sent extradition papers to Texas and collected Sandusky, who traveled without issue. He didn't cause any ruckus or anything. And that's when Charles revealed that after stabbing his wife, he ran to the Snake River and clung to a plank of wood that he had rowed to an island about 2 miles below Hammett. The island was surrounded by tall willows and wild rose bushes, which was an ideal hiding place for him for about 3 to 4 days before moving on. And then after revealing the hiding place, a cattleman actually looking for his cattle discovered this little island and where he had been sleeping. Then it's time for his trial, and he's tried in Mountain Home, and while in the trial, he actually threatens everyone in the courtroom, warning that what he'd do to his family and onlookers if he was ever given liberty. Yes.
What?
He's found guilty of assault with a deadly weapon with intent to commit murder and sentenced to serve not less than 7 nor more than 14 years at the Idaho State Penitentiary. He arrives on April 4th, 1918 at the prison. And during his incarceration, his wife is granted a divorce, and she and the children moved to Pocatello,
Good.
Idaho.
Yeah, they should.
Yeah. And, he's quarrelsome and boastful all throughout his time.
I don't like
here.
him.
Yeah, so here's his intake information. He's received April 4th, 1918, alias F.T. Lynn, County, Elmore, sentenced 7 to 14 years, age 33, born in Missouri, height 5 feet 5 inches, complexion medium, weight 127 pounds, build slender, size of boot 6, hair color brown, eye color blue, married with 5 children, Floyd, Lloyd, Bernice, Carlisle, Norma. And parents were listed as living, and he left his parents' home at the age of 16. He grew up in the Methodist Church, had an 8th grade education, and was a moderate drinker. In 1918, a year into his sentence, his father dies at the age of 52 or 53. Sometime while he's incarcerated, he's given the job, I believe, of replacing the cement in front of that territorial prison.
Okay.
And that's when I believe he put the permanent mark, May 1921, CCS into it. And the most convincing evidence I have comes from his Bertillon chart, which shows his tattoos. And besides the moles on his face and his back and a birthmark on his left buttock, Charles had a tattoo with 3 letters on his forearm. Any guesses?
I'm going to guess it's CCS.
CCS on his right
Interesting.
forearm. Yeah, so actually, if you look at the Bertillon here,
That even looks like, yeah.
it looks very similar.
Totally does.
What the warden drew on this Bertillon looks just like what is written on the floor.
Do you think that's what it really, that C is what it really looked like? Or do you think that's just the way that the officer drew that C? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Because then that sort of matches that swirl right here at the top of the 2.
Yeah, it does. I don't know. It's super similar. We'll post photos of it on our Facebook group. So please join our Facebook group.
Nice plug.
So he applies for parole several times during his incarceration. August of 1921, his sentence was commuted to 7 years with good behavior allowance. I know. On January 10th, 1923, a model prisoner, Charles Sandusky, is pardoned early on good time with no write-ups on his file. Upon his release, he headed to Pocatello, where his ex-wife and children were living. Yes. The next day, Charles attempts to break into his ex-wife's home when he finds out that she is remarried and she has started a new family.
First of all, good for her.
Right.
Second of all, how does he find out where she lives? Like, just asking around town?
I imagine so. Yeah. His 16-year-old son, Floyd, the one that's named after his brother, heard the commotion, picks up a revolver and shoots his father. Blows his father's nose off.
What?
Yes. So Charles was attempting to break into that home, and so Floyd thought, you know what, this is.
Did he know it was his dad, or did he just think it was like someone breaking in?
I feel like he knew it was his dad.
Okay, so sorry, how long was he in prison for?
It was about 1917 to 1923.
So 6 years.
Yeah.
So Floyd would have been like 10 when so he would have been old enough to understand what had gone on.
Yeah.
Oh, that
So he's
poor
16.
kid.
Charles is rushed to the hospital where he spends a week in treatment. And leaving the hospital, he purchases a train ticket back to St. Joseph, Missouri to stay with his family. His mother's still alive. And January 19th, 1923, he boards the train, unaware that his son Floyd was following close behind.
Oh my gosh.
Floyd boards the train with a heavy caliber revolver in hand and malice towards his father in his heart. Charles had threatened to retaliate against the whole family, and Floyd wasn't going to let that happen. So he searched the train and spotted his bandaged up father sitting next to another passenger. He raises the revolver and shoots his father 5 times in the chest.
Oh!
Charles died instantly, and Floyd laid his gun down. And he's taken to the county jail, where he expressed complete gratification before going to sleep. Floyd is never charged for the murder of his father. Yeah, the jury actually deemed the teenager's action self-defense. And that is the life, times, and death of Charles Cleveland Sandusky. Yeah.
Man, Floyd, I can't say I blame him. Like, what would you do if you, he was maybe asleep, but like probably watched your father stab your mother 22 times.
Right.
While she's 7 months pregnant.
And he's probably gone a lot of the time, and when he does come home, he's probably just evil, like abusing his mother. So his only memories probably of his father is pure abuse and all of this. So I think he saw the potential of something worse happening to his whole family and to protect them, which the jury saw fit as self-defense to protect them. He takes his father's life. And Floyd would actually serve time at this institution about 10 years later in the 1930s for a short time, and he got into a bit of trouble himself.
What was it? Was it for a violent crime or like a forgery sort of?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
It's a rough story. It's a long one.
Nice job, Anthony.
And his poet, she would live until I think into her 80s, and she married twice, or her second husband passed away, and then she married
and she had
third
more
husband.
kids.
And she did have more kids. Yeah, so she had a long,
good. I'm so
hopefully
glad.
good life. Yeah, I really hope that whole family,
they deserve better than that.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and Floyd, and actually a lot of the family lived pretty good long lives, and I found like all the marriage records of his daughters and his sons, and so that's Charles Sandusky.
Like a bad guy.
Yeah,
I don't like him.
I'm with you there.
Yeah.
I'm with you there. Anyone who, I don't know.
I went camping this weekend, and you know when you're camping and you just start thinking about like weird stuff. And my friend that was with me asked, would it be worse to be like killed or attacked by someone you know, or someone like a total stranger? And I think it would be worse to be attacked or killed by someone that you know, because what that means is they have some major rage, some major problem with you as a person, that they are willing to take your life. Like if it's a stranger, like they don't know you, this is just like a convenience thing, a thrill thing, which not that makes that any better, but I'm just for me as a person, I would hate the idea that someone I knew was like willing to take my life, and especially a husband, a spouse.
Yeah, the head of the household.
Yeah,
like, that's how he's described in all these things. Like, ugh. Yeah.
I'm so glad she lived. I'm so glad the family got away from it. I don't want to say I ever condone killing, but he sort of deserved it. So, wow.
Right.
I mean,
I know this story, like this all spurred from a fourth grader going, what does the CCS mean? And when I started uncovering the story, it's one of those ones that will always stick with me. Like, man.
Yeah, those stories that just make your like jaw drop open. And you're just like, I'm sorry, what did I just read?
Excuse me? Yeah.
Wow. Well, per usual, great job, Anthony.
Oh, thanks, Skye. It was a rough one.
Yeah, that's rough.
I did this research, about a year ago when this happened. So this has kind of been brewing inside me for a really long time. So to like finally release it so that everybody else has to think about it.
Yeah,
no, I apologize.
I'll be thinking about it also. If you like the podcast, please consider making a donation. You can do that by going to store.history.idaho.gov/donation.aspx. Be sure to click the Behind Gray Walls podcast tab on the left side of the page. Any donation amount is appreciated and will go toward improving the quality of this podcast, enabling us to bring you the stories that we love and that we hope you love too.
Please like and follow our Facebook page, Old Idaho Penitentiary. From there, you can connect with us directly by joining the Behind Gray Walls podcast group, where you can find the mugshots of the inmates featured in today's episode, supplementary images of the penitentiary, and discussions between group members. We'd love to see you there.
All right, well, let's try to lighten things up a little bit. Again, her the one I'm doing is not as funny as like Sam Stevens was after Josie's, but it does have a bit of a happier ending.
Oh, good.
So
yes, please, thank you.
Okay, so my inmate today, her name is Hannah Folden. She's number 3281. So as I said, she was in for violation of prohibition laws, and I'll get a little bit into prohibition. Most of us, I think, have an idea of what prohibition is. And I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than just like, we don't like alcohol. But, I'll just do a really brief overview of that. So let's see. So sources, I've got her inmate file again, per usual. Ancestry.com, as I think I said at the top of the show, is chock full of her records, which I didn't originally have access to. They're very exciting. I found out so much cool stuff, and I'll get into that. And I already told Anthony one of the things I found out that was different, so he won't be surprised by that. But anyway, I did use Wikipedia a little bit, but I checked sources. Please check sources if you use Wikipedia. For the most part, people do a pretty good job at citing. They're usually legit sources, but do check that.
Or just go to the sources and read the sources yourself.
So sometimes, though, that's hard because they're like books you have to check out from the... I'm lazy is what it comes down to. Anthony, listen, I don't work as hard as you. I also... So there's lots of sources online about Prohibition. I just picked one kind of at random that seemed good. It's u-s-history.com, just an article on Prohibition. Nice. It seemed like a place where like students, like high school students or whatever, could go to get like an overview. That's all I needed. So yeah. I also found a really great article about Prohibition in Idaho. It's called Distilled, A History of Idaho's Alcohol Laws by Samantha Wright of Boise State Public Radio. So thank you to her for that. It was really, I found that article before. It's actually it's a really, really good article. So Hannah Folden was born on July 4th, 1875 to Auguste and Matilda Hilden. So she was almost exactly born on America's birthday, almost on its 99th birthday, actually. Wow. But not that it matters because her intake forms say that she was born in Sweden, so she doesn't care about the 4th of July. However, census, marriage, and her death records state that she was actually born in Kemi, Finland. Which is a little bit different. They're close to one another. Here's why there may have been a little bit of confusion. I looked this up. So Kemi, Finland is a town in the Bothnian Bay of Finland, which is less than 30 kilometers to the Swedish border. So they're pretty close. So she may have been born in Finland, maybe lived in Sweden, or maybe they just were so close that she, the borders may not have been quite as solid. Well, that's not true, actually. I don't know anything about Scandinavian history, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I do. Yeah. But they were really close, so may have been interchangeable in her mind. I don't know. She may have been an only child. I couldn't find evidence of siblings, but if I remember correctly, the nearest of kin that she listed was not a name that I had seen before. I think it was a female name with a different last name. That may have been a sibling. It may have been a child. I couldn't quite tell which that was. So she may have been the only child, but like I said, I couldn't find any evidence. Her father died in 1887 in Sweden or Finland. There is no official immigration date or immigration document that I could find, but according to the 1900 census record I found of her, it actually states that they immigrated in 1890. So a couple years after her father died, which would make sense. It's possible that, her mother wanted to have a better life. And so they came over in 1890. The intake form states that their port of entry was through Quebec, Canada. They then settled in the Midwest, which was a popular area for Scandinavians. We talk about the accent out there, and I'm also a massive Golden Girls fan. Rose is from St. Olaf, Minnesota. St. Olaf. And so, so they settled in the Midwest, which, there's lots of people there like them. So that makes sense. The next record I found of her is on November 5th, 1892. Hannah marries a man named Matthias Reini, probably R-E-I-N-I. He's another Finnish immigrant. They get married in Calumet, Michigan. Now, Calumet, Michigan is part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It's actually above Wisconsin. And so when I looked this up on a map, I was like, that looks like it's on Wisconsin, but because I didn't know that portion of Michigan was up buttressed against Wisconsin. So learn new stuff every day. Hannah and Matthias would end up having 3 children, Arthur William, Hannah, or other records call her Heino, H-E-I-N-O. I tried to look up that name. It's mostly a German masculine name. So I don't know if that's correct. These census records, their names vary so much. And then their last daughter, her name was Hattie. Matthias was a miner by trade, probably a copper miner. Houghton or Houghton County, I don't know how to pronounce the GH sometimes, in Michigan, was actually part of Michigan's copper country. Ton of copper coming out of that area. So he was probably a copper miner. Mining, as we know, in the early 20th century is pretty dangerous. Yes. So Matthias... Lucrative, but very dangerous. So he probably died sometime between 1900 and 1910. I couldn't find a death record. I couldn't find a divorce record. But he sort of disappears from the records between those years. And so I would assume if he was alive, we would have found maybe some other marriage records, something like that. And so I'm assuming that he died. Could be a wrong assumption. This is what's hard about these early inmates, is if they're not listed in those records, they're just gone. Now, I know that he is not around by 1910 because in the 1910 census, she is married to a man named James Folden. Actually, in the 1910 census, it's listed as Golden. James is a Norwegian immigrant, and they are living in Sandpoint, Idaho. It states that they had been married for 4 years, meaning they got married in 1906. However, their official marriage certificate is from 1921.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? So probably what happens, and this is very common in early years, and actually through the 50s, is they probably got in what's called a common law marriage in 1906. Common law marriages, for those of you who don't know, are marriages that there's basically no official marriage ceremony, but parties agree to live together basically as man and wife. That is a way that they can participate in sexual relations without legal repercussions. They kind of have to maintain marital responsibilities. So basically the men go out and work, the women home make, and it's really interesting. Most of the time, all the couple have to say, they just have to say out loud that, like, we're in a common law marriage, and like, boom, they're married. Yeah. It's so legally binding that they actually have to get an official legal divorce in order to divorce. It's such a weird, interesting loophole. I have not figured it out because there's lots of women inmates and probably male inmates as well who are in common law marriages. I have such a hard time figuring it out. So common law marriages are actually legal still in 8 states: Colorado, Iowa, Kansas, Montana, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Texas, Utah, and also in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. But be careful, because common law marriages can be used to prosecute on bigamy charges. So just because, if you say in any of those states, we are married, and then you legally marry someone else, you can be brought up on bigamy charges. So if you want to get into a common law marriage, I imagine those are much less common these days because there is a lot of just, cohabitating without marriage, and that's great.
What are the benefits?
Yeah, a lot of times, and this is actually, I found there's this great article that I didn't include a lot about, but it's from a 1998 Yale Law Journal article, and it's called Governing Through Contract, Common Law Marriage in the 19th Century by Ariella R. Dubler. And they talk about kind of what the benefits are of this. And a lot of times, especially for women, this was a really useful tactic because if their husbands died, they could collect insurance. They could get any sort of benefits that a legally married wife could get. So they basically get everything that an officially married couple could get. They just didn't have that official wedding ceremony. It is considered a legal contract in the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Would people, if their families didn't approve of a marriage, would that be a reason to be common law married?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely could be. It also could be a way to make a childbirth legitimate, is saying, they didn't get, because, illegitimacy in the late 19th, early 20th century is highly frowned upon. I always hate including that in the bios that I write because there are a lot of children that they write that are illegitimate, which I hate using that phrase. They're not illegitimate. They just, their parents weren't married. But that was a problem back then. And so this was a way of, if for whatever reason you got pregnant before you were married, you could just, say, oh, we're married. Yeah. And then all of a sudden your child is quote unquote legitimate.
That's great.
Yeah. So common law marriages are super interesting. Like I said, I don't fully understand them, but there are 8 states where you can still do it. Idaho is not one of them, but you can still do it. If you're interested, head to any of those states.
I was going to say, I didn't get married until our 10-year anniversary of being together. So we could have been easily considered common law for
and
a couple years.
That is the difference in today's stuff, is you do have to be, I think, living together for 7 years. And I don't even think at that point you necessarily even have to say it. You could technically say that you're in a common law marriage if it's been 7 years or longer.
Wow.
That wasn't the case back then. I think you could be living together for a day and be like, hey, we're married, and that's it. But now, it usually takes about 7 years for that to become in effect. So yeah, I mean, you and Becky may have been common law married and didn't even know it, except not in the state. You would have had to be in Utah or Texas or Montana. All right, so that was a wormhole I went down. It was common law marriage. So James and Hannah end up having 2 kids of their own, Edwin James and Helen. They also had another son. His name was Roy, but in 1912 he was about a year old. He died of pneumonia. which is really sad. So she had 6 children altogether, but did have one die early. Now, as I mentioned, they were officially married. They were married in Thompson Falls, Montana on September 19th, 1921. They did eventually divorce. I couldn't find any document of it, but a lot of times those early divorce documents aren't available on Ancestry. I think in Idaho they don't even start until like the 1950s. But they would have had to officially they were officially married at this point, but even if they hadn't, they would have had to go through the courts to get divorced. And I know he didn't die because his death date is not until 1948. I found his death certificate. We know that she wasn't widowed by him. Mm-hmm. Now, during their separation, maybe after their divorce, Hannah begins living with a man named Walter W. Brackett. He was a World War I veteran. Now, keep this in mind for later. Keep this name in mind. He will come up here in a little bit. Now, as I said, Hannah was arrested for violation of Prohibition laws. Now, here's my little 5-minute Prohibition overview. This is a really simplified overview of Prohibition, so I'm sure I'm missing lots of stuff, but we'll do what we can. So, Prohibition was passed ratified, I should say, in 1920. It's the 18th Amendment. There's lots of intricacies leading up to this act, as I said. Basically, in the early 19th century, temperance societies, basically what that meant, tempering alcohol consumption, temperance societies began popping up all over the country because it's really widely believed that alcoholism leads to a lot of societal problems. It leads to spousal abuse, and it eventually leads to widespread poverty. So that's kind of what these temperance societies are trying to stop. During the Civil War, there are bigger things on the political minds of people. So temperance societies sort of take a back seat. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction, they really ramp up again. These lead to organizations like the Anti-Saloon League in 1893, and these smaller groups start to focus on ridding society of alcohol at the local level. And this is really where we're going to start our examination of Prohibition in Idaho. So around the 1880s, the Women Christians Temperance Union, the WCTU, this is probably the biggest temperance organization around the country. Just Christian women banding together to rid their societies of alcohol, their communities of alcohol. So the WCTU, they pop up in Lewiston and Boise, and then that is followed by local Anti-Saloon League chapters in both places. In 1907, the Anti-Saloon League manages to get a measure on the ballot called the Sabbath Law in Idaho, and it passes in 1907, making the sale of alcohol on Sunday illegal. Mm-hmm. It's not, it's a start. Again,
it's a first step.
These are Christians, so Sundays are those sacred days. You don't do anything, you're not supposed to on Sunday, and now that includes buying and selling alcohol. Mm-hmm. Then, 8 years later, in 1915, Idaho elects the state's only Jewish governor, and he was actually only the second Jewish governor in the country at the time. His name is Moses Alexander, which is one of my favorite names. Mm-hmm. Other than Barzilla J. Clark. I've talked about this before. I love that name so much. Moses Alexander, he runs on a Prohibition platform, and once elected, this becomes one of his first major points, one of his first major changes of his gubernatorial career. So a constitutional amendment is passed in the state of Idaho in 1916, outlawing all sales of alcohol. Prohibition starts in Idaho in 1916. It passed by 71%. That's crazy. 71% of Idaho voters voted to outlaw the sale of alcohol. That's how big of an issue this was, right in the late, and actually this is kind of right before World War I, and then around the country things really got ramped up during and after World War I.
And it shows how effective that the local Idaho chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance, the
WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League, absolutely, and but really, I think it has a lot to do with the upper and middle class women, because these are the women who are the ones who kind of have the most say in society. The lower class women, who are probably honestly the ones who are dealing most often with their husbands coming home drunk and being drunk and beating their wives. They're the ones who have to deal with
their
it.
Paychecks,
but they're also not listened to because they're poor. So it's the middle and upper class women think it's their duty to help these poor lower class people. They're the ones who really, I think, have a big say in this.
Yeah. Do you know what kind of things that they did? Would they hold rallies or
meetings?
I
think petitions. They would hold meetings. I think they're also going to be passing stuff out on the streets. And they have, frankly, I had a history professor who called it pillow talk. They had a voice in their husbands' ears. Their husbands are the ones who have this, again, they're upper and middle class, so they have the say. They oftentimes are the lawmakers themselves, or they're buddies with the lawmakers. And so they, when they're, when you're laying in bed and you're falling asleep and you're talking about whatever, you say like, listen, I saw Mrs. Sandusky the other day, and I'll tell you what, her husband just is, he's beating her all the time. And I know it's because of alcohol. I just think we need to really help her out, and this is the way to do it. And so women aren't given enough credit for having a say in, women at this time were allowed to vote in Idaho, but in 1916 had not been passed in the country yet. Yeah. That's not going to come for another 2-3 years.
Right. We'll post the photo of Moses with this league. And
interestingly, there is a woman. It's as I think he's signing the bill into effect. Exactly, and it's all men except one woman right next to him. And I don't know who it is. All the pictures, because all the articles about Prohibition in Idaho use this picture. It's the only one we have. Yeah. And they don't say who that woman is. I don't know if she's maybe a head of the WCTU or the Anti-Saloon League, if it's his wife or his daughter, basically a political prop to say, look at what we're doing for the people. Yeah. She's on my side. But that's kind of, 1916 is when this starts. The 18th Amendment prohibiting all sale of alcohol across the nation is passed, ratified, and put into effect on January 16th, 1920. So Idaho outlaws it 4 whole years before the rest of the nation. So bootlegging, or making and selling your own alcohol, becomes huge because people still want alcohol. Alcohol has been around since almost the beginning of time. This is not anything new. People like it. What are you going to do? And so jails also start to fill up with people violating prohibition laws. So this is where Hannah comes in. She was first convicted for having intoxicating liquor in her possession on October 17th, 1921 in Sandpoint. Now, I didn't mention this before. Sandpoint is north of Coeur d'Alene. It's about a few hours from the Canadian border. It's actually the county seat of Bonner County. It's one of our northernmost and largest cities
just
up
under
there.
Boundary County, which is
called Boundary. Called Boundary County because it's on the boundary of the U.S. and Canada. So Hannah, for this first conviction, probably just spent some time in the Bonner County jail or paid some kind of restitution for her crime. This doesn't stop her. She likes alcohol. I always find that Europeans often tend to be in for prohibition, and this is probably because in Europe they don't have that much problem with alcohol. Right. So they're used to it, they like it, and so having this prohibition that you don't want to stop. Who doesn't like alcohol? So she is, quote, caught with the goods after numerous complaints in September 1922. She actually pleads not guilty. She pled not guilty to the first one as well. I think I put in my bio that she was caught after hiding it in her house. I couldn't find where I found that information the first time. I'm always so skeptical of these early bios that I wrote because I'm like, where did I get that information? But regardless, she is caught the second time. She pleads not guilty. The jury convicts her of multiple infractions of prohibition laws, and she is sentenced to 1 to 24 months at the Idaho State Penitentiary. Here's what some prison officials say about her. They say, quote, she is a persistent violator of liquor laws, regards them as puritanical blue laws, more honored in the breach than in the observance, so say most of us. Which is an interesting statement because what he's saying is, yeah, I agree with her. We are honoring this law by breaking it much more than we are by obeying it.
And who said that?
So this is, on those, I didn't have a picture of the front side of the sheet where it says what they are. So there's the prosecuting attorney or the judge, and on the back it'll say do they have criminal tendencies and describe their crime and describe their associates. It's one of those, but I don't have the front side where it says what he is. So it's either a prison official or a prosecuting attorney or a judge, which is so interesting. I know. But this kind of gives you an idea of how much people really started to dislike this law. It's just putting a lot of people in jail unnecessarily. It's filling up jails, and it's all just so that people don't get drunk, Yeah. Another, this is actually on the same form. It says that she's okay on all tendencies but illicit cohabitation and bootlegging, which is how we know she was living with Walter before she came into the prison. And then overall, the same official says she pays all bills promptly, has raised her family carefully, is a hard worker and persistent bootlegger. So he says overall she's a good lady. She's just is breaking laws.
She's
and
a contributing member of society.
I love that it says she raised her family carefully. She's got these 5 kids. She's trying to make sure that they do right. But she likes alcohol, and, who could blame her? So she appeals her conviction to the Supreme Court, but they sustain the original conviction on the grounds that there were no reversible errors in her trial, which is a lot of times how things get reversed. That's how, Josie and Alfred Friel's got reversed, is because they said, we don't even know that the crime happened in Elmore County, so we shouldn't have been prosecuting them there. Those sort of things that, there's an error, or there was a podcast I was listening to the other day where they said that a thing got overturned because the jury was given the wrong instructions about what crime they could convict her on. Yeah. So it's stuff like that. They said there weren't any reversible errors that they could. So her conviction was upheld. She entered the women's ward on June 24th, 1923. The day after she arrives, the prison physician takes a look at her, and he says some not very nice things about her. So she is 5'5", 223 pounds, and he states that she, quote, was very fat and stout, like a sack of feathers tied in the middle. Oh. Yeah.
Whoa.
And then he says that the arches of her feet were broken from excessive weight.
Oh, my gosh.
Listen, 223 is a little bit larger than average. It's not that heavy, especially for a 5'5" woman. It's not like she's super short and really big. I mean, she's 48 years old when she comes into the prison. She's had 6 kids. Yeah. She's just like a stay-at-home mom. Arches of her feet were broken from excessive weight. She's not that heavy.
No, that description.
Yeah.
Like a sack of
feathers tied in the middle.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Yeah, it's a little rough. I mean, I guess if her arches of her feet were truly broken, then that is a way to identify her. She also could have just naturally had, small arches. It's not unheard of.
Right. Yeah.
But okay, prison physician. So by July, Hannah is already asking for a reprieve of her sentence. And she's granted it. There's one condition. The condition of her reprieve is that she would go and care for Walter Brackett, with whom she'd been living. And this is because he had contracted tuberculosis in France, and he needed full-time care. She was caring for him before she came into the prison, using a lot of her own money to care for him, pretty much putting all of her time and effort. By this time, most of her kids are fully grown. Her last 2 kids are in their late teens, early 20s. So she is really, caring for him, and he needs help. And so the parole board agrees. They give her this reprieve on this condition. So they say if there ever comes a point where he gets better or doesn't need her help anymore, that she would come back to the penitentiary to finish out her sentence. She had to write the governor of Idaho, who at this point his name was Charles C. Moore. She had to write him every 30 days detailing the physical condition of Walter, which is the way that they know if he's getting better or not, which... If there's no one checking on him, I would just be like, oh, he's not better yet. But anyway, she also had to stay out of Bonner County, likely until she is released from her conditional parole or pardoned. So what she does is she pays $300 to the state for any expenses occurred if she returns. Basically, she says, here's $300. If you have to bring me back, just use that money. This is what I looked up. Do you want to guess? Do you want to guess how much money this is in 2019?
That's probably... $1,600?
It is $4,500
What?
in 2019. This is why I was like, what?
Oh my god.
That's so much money.
Whoa.
I don't know how she has that much money. I mean, I don't know if maybe when Matthias died, if they had quite a bit of money from that, and if she got some sort of, if he died on the job, she probably would have gotten some kind of collection maybe from the company, could have had insurance out on him. It could be that James Folden pays, for the kids, some sort of child support. I don't know how she has this much money. And she's talked about that she's used a ton of money to take care of Walter. 45, she pays... Straight up writes him a check for $300 and says, here, in case they ever come back. I don't know if she ever got that money back. Because, spoiler alert, she does not come back. Mm-hmm. So, pays this $300/$4,500. I can't even think about that. Wow. She leaves the penitentiary on August 2nd, 1923. She served 1 month and 9 days, barely her minimum sentence. She takes Walter down to Phoenix, Arizona, probably because of the heat. A lot of the early doctors said that you should go to tropical places, warmer places. That's going to be better for your tuberculosis than fall and winter's coming. It's cold. That's going to restrict their ability to breathe because it's going to, restrict your lungs and things like that. So she goes down to Arizona, cares for him. After her reprieve, officials note that she is truly devoting her time, effort, and money to caring for Walter, so she is officially pardoned on July 2nd, 1925. Probably after her pardon, she can return to Idaho. Her kids were still, at least her youngest kids were still in the state. As I said, they were young adults by this time, so, they didn't need her to take care of them, but her kids are still here. So on October 5th, 1925, she marries Walter W. Brackett in Bonner County. They lived in Sandpoint. Now, Walter died probably from complications of tuberculosis on November 13th, 1927. So they did get 2 full years to be together, not including the time that they were living together before. So they were probably together for, a good half a decade or so. Then in the 1930 census, Hannah is living in Sandpoint with Edward and Helen, her 2 youngest kids, and as I said, they're in their early 20s. She died on July 17th, 1933, at the age of 58, from a cerebral hemorrhage, which is probably the end result of what's called arteriosclerosis, which is a disease that causes hardening of your arteries, especially as you get older. That makes sense. She is buried in Lakeview Cemetery in Sandpoint as Hannah Brackett. So she kept his last name. I think she loved him a lot. And, they did have kind of that mutual, she took care of him, but I think she genuinely loved him. Sadly, she did not get to see the end of Prohibition. The 21st Amendment, which repealed Prohibition, it was passed and ratified on December 5th, 1933. So she died about 5 months before the end of Prohibition. Here's a fun fact. I didn't know this. Utah was the last state's vote that was needed to help officially repeal the 18th Amendment, which is interesting. You wouldn't think that. I read that the LDS Church was very much trying to influence the politicians to not ratify the 21st Amendment, but they did. So go Utah. I do want to say that the reason I picked her is because I couldn't decide if I wanted to do a prohibition violator or an adulterer, because we do have quite a few adulterers in here. And I asked my friend what she wanted to hear, and she wanted to hear about the prohibition, and she is from Utah. So
shout out,
Shell, that's for you. So yeah, that is Hannah Folden, one of our actually only 2 prohibition violators, women anyway. I'm sure there were lots of men.
There were so many,
lots and lots of men, but those were one of our 2 women, Hannah Folden.
Nice work, Skye.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very cool. She looks fun.
Yeah, she just is a little Finnish Scandinavian old lady.
Yeah.
She's not that old. She's only 48. Mm-hmm. I mean, she has not young kids, but she's got kids, and she's probably a grandma at this point. I think her oldest was born in 1893, so by 1923, he's in his 30s. So she probably is a grandma, and she's just living her life, just living the immigrant life. She was a naturalized U.S. citizen by the 1930s, I believe. So. Dang. There you go.
All right.
Not quite as exciting.
Oh yeah.
But
or brutal and
horrible. a little happier.
Yeah. Her taking care of this World War I veteran, like that's a sweet.
I know, it's kind of sweet. Huh?
And then the parole board, like seeing really how pivotal she is to his health and his life.
Yeah, because I thought that was really interesting, because in a lot of the later women that I'm looking at, people will write in and say, like, listen, I really need her back. She needs to care for her kids. We're having this problem and that problem. And the warden says, like, listen, I really want to help you, but she has to serve her minimum sentence. And usually the minimum sentence is 18 months. This is earlier. This is the 1920s. And she did serve her minimum sentence. So, it is really kind of interesting that the parole board was so willing. And I think people, as that one where the prison official says, like, so say we all.
Right.
I think they realized that this is a dumb charge. Like, no one, I think I read, it's funny because I couldn't find it after I read it, but I thought I read that like 60% of Idahoans wanted to repeal the 18th Amendment by 1933. And so I think even just off the bat, people were like, this was a bad idea. It's very much that thing where when you outlaw something, it doesn't make it go away. It makes it backdoor and it makes it dangerous.
That's it.
And
the amount of deaths that occurred because of
from bathtub gin and like just people don't know how to make alcohol the right way. And like that's a serious problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I think FDR, it was his idea to make this new amendment. The 21st Amendment is the only amendment that repeals another amendment.
Yeah.
So
love that.
yeah.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Sorry, that was probably more history than like her, but this actually, Prohibition, the 1920s, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, like my favorite eras to study in school. So I'm very interested in all of that.
Very good. All right, Skye. Nice work.
So tune in next week to find out who we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. Well, do your own time.
Do your own number.
See you next week. If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.